We know there are a lot of issues that we face as a community and as a state, and the better skilled we are at learning how and knowing how to navigate that. There's a part of the cross and our faith that calls us to be involved in the social ills of our culture. And it's not just an inward thing, it's an outward thing. And we appreciate Trait being here to share his knowledge and information with us. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on intro, but I thought it was appropriate that we open with a word of prayer. And I would just encourage you to remember those people who need extra grace in their lives. That's probably all of us, but some need it in special ways. Kadeen Nelson, Marvin Nelson's wife, who was on our staff for about 6 years and just a marvelous person, passed away this morning. And Sharon Lutz is just not well. And there are others, so let's open with prayer. Lord, we thank you for the privilege of being together. We thank you for this community called New Covenant. We take our walk with you, our discipleship, seriously, inwardly and outwardly. We thank you for Trait's willingness to share his knowledge with us. We pray that we know that you are the teacher, the Holy Spirit. And we pray that you'd speak to us through what we're going to learn tonight in ways that not only do we not know, but in things that we need to understand and hear as we engage not only this system that we live in, but as we engage the world. Be here tonight, we pray. We give you thanks again for the privilege. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Trait, thank you.
Thank you. So, wow, this is a really nice turnout. Thanks to everybody who came tonight. Because of where I work, we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second, I get questions all the time about what's going on at the legislature and different bills that are moving through the process, and then basic questions about, hey, how do I contact my legislators, and how do I know what's going on up there, and what's the best way? Do I call them? Do I email them? Do I show up? And so that was the genesis of this class, is basically getting some basic information to you guys about how is the most productive way to interact with your legislators. Now, what I'm going to focus on here tonight is on the state level, because that's where kind of most of the emphasis has been on here lately, especially with what's going on with teachers and some of the other issues that have been in the forefront of people's minds. But most of the principles that I'm talking about here today will work at the city council level, at the federal level, whatever level of representation that we have in our government. And so I want to tell you a little bit, there we are, just a little bit of where I am, where I came from, and why I may be qualified to stand in front of you tonight. I started working in the legislature in 2010. Before that, I got my master's in public administration from Texas A&M University. Whoop! I started working. I went to work as the legislative director and the policy advisor to the pro tem in the Senate in 2010. And so you might say, well, what does that mean? Basically what that means is for 4 years, I directed the pro tem's legislative agenda through the state Senate. And basically I read every single bill that came through the state Senate for 4 years. So Sarah would know I would come home with a stack of bills about this high every night, and I would read through each and every single bill, because I'm the one who had to understand what those bills were doing. I had to understand who they would affect, and we had to kind of make a decision on what committees they should be assigned to, what was the implication of the policy, did we like these bills, did we not like these bills, and so I got really, really good at legislative procedure. And then from then, I would go through and I would track those bills all the way through the committee process and through the legislature all the way to the end. And that's what I did for about 4 years in the Senate. And then in 2014, I moved over to manage the Capitol Restoration Project, and I still work in the building, and I'm still very much connected to the legislature. Since then, I've written pieces of legislation that have gone almost nowhere. I'm still working. There have been great pieces of legislation, but I've written legislation, and I work with legislators on a daily basis, and so this is a world that I'm intimately familiar with. And so I'm going to share some knowledge, just so you guys understand. I'm going to stick with procedure. I'm not going to get into politics. I'm not going to tell you if a bill is a good bill or a bad bill. I'm happy to answer questions on a factual basis. Maybe if you have a bill you want to ask about what would this bill do, I'm happy to address that. But as far as what you should think about a particular bill, those are waters that I don't think I'm going to wade into tonight for obvious reasons. So, one of the other I'm also an adjunct professor. I've taught for almost 10 years, and now I'm teaching classes at OU. I'm in the middle now of a spring class called Tracking Legislation, which is where I take my students into a really deep dive into legislative procedure. We will barely scratch the surface on that tonight, just enough to make you dangerous. And then in the fall, I teach a class called Issue Advocacy that teaches people basically how to be advocates for the issues they care about at the Capitol. So, what do you think this quote means? And you're allowed to talk. I found this quote and I thought it was a good one. So what do you think it means?
Things move slow.
Bill says things move slow. You hit the nail on the head. Politics is the strong and slow boring of hard boards. That quote was uttered by Max Weber, who is a German political philosopher. If you really want to dive into the depths, you can go explore what a Weberian bureaucracy is when you have time. But basically what this means is that when you're dealing in politics, change comes in increments. As most of us are not good with slow incremental change, most of us want things to be fast and we want to change it right now. In politics, you have to be willing to stick with things for the long haul. You have to be willing to take your victories where you can get them and come back and fight the next year and get a little more and get a little more and get a little more. I always tell my students, rarely do you want your government to move fast. Because most of the time when government moves fast, the unintended consequences can be pretty severe. But once again, it's a frustrating thing because if you're going to engage in politics, it can get wearisome over time. But that's just something that we have to deal with because we have to be willing to sort of work with and through the process. With as many people that are involved, you think about everyone involved in the political process. Well, you think, okay, there's our elected officials, and there are those, but there's a whole vast array of people involved in the policymaking process beyond our elected officials. There's you and me. There are all of the state government agencies. There are the advocacy and interest groups who advocate for different issues up at the Capitol. There's the media. There are all kind of people who are involved in the political process. And just as soon as you go and talk to your representative and say, this is a great idea, you need to do this, there will be 14 people that come behind you to say, this is a terrible idea, you don't need to do this. And it's the job of our representatives to really know their district, to vote in the ways that their district hopefully would have them vote, and then to do the best they can. But it's not an easy job. And, I'm not here to say, obviously, people feel different ways about our political representation. But it is very much not an easy job to do. Let's start at the basics here. How do I find my legislator? How do I find my legislator? So that's the first step. So before you can go and petition your government, you have to know who you need to petition. So you need to go to a website for the Oklahoma legislature, oklegislature.gov. And then where you see the arrow pointed down the bottom, there's a box called Find My Legislator. Go type your address into that box, and it'll pop up not only who your state legislators are, but who your federal representation is as well. So I typed mine in, and since Jay's recording this, I'm not going to do this live so everyone knows where I live, but oh, there it is. Nope. Any help?
You just click and I'll click it. Oh man, good job.
Oh, okay. So I typed mine in. So I took a screen capture of this particular part. So my state senator is Adam Pugh. My state representative is Lewis Moore. Now, what's handy about this is you can go click on Pugh's name or click on Moore's name, and it'll take them to their personal website on the legislature's page, and it'll have all their contact information. It'll have where you can send them an email. It'll have their office number in the Capitol building. It'll also have the phone number for their office in there. So go in there and you can type that in. Now, one thing I want to make clear is we need to understand what the issue is. So this is our state senator and our state representative. So if you called or emailed these people about what would be a federal issue, Social Security, the EPA, whatever it is that might be an issue that is being handled by the federal government, they would say, it's not our bag of fun that we have to deal with here. You've got to call your federal representation. So they would direct you to our U.S. senators are James Lankford and Jim Inhofe. And for most of us here in the Oklahoma City area, our federal congressman is Steve Russell. So if you're interested in state issues and you call your federal reps, so if you call Lankford's office and say, hey, I'm interested in, the teacher pay issue, Lankford's office is going to say, thanks, but you need to call your state people. So that's the first thing you know is you kind of have to have an understanding of what issues you're dealing with and who you should contact. So I have friends who are members of the legislature who people will tell them, run into them in the grocery store all the time, and they'll say, hey, how was Washington, D.C. this week? And they work at the state capitol. So a lot of people don't understand that difference between state senator, state representative, and your federal representation. So that's the first thing that you need to understand after you find your legislator. Next one. So I had this little slide because I think a lot of people don't understand what it is sort of in the day-to-day life of what it means to be a legislator. I think in some cases we may have some unrealistic expectations. There's the expectation out there that this is sort of it's a part-time job. They don't really do all that much. And that's actually not the case, especially for the people that actually do it well. So most public officials spend their time in meetings, attending functions, and in legislative hearings or legislative sessions. So there's a particular time when your legislators are super, super busy, and that's this time of the year right now. The legislative session every year is from February to May. And so it is going to be much more difficult to get in touch with your legislators at this time of the year than maybe later on in the year. And during these times, most of the time they're up. A lot of times they might go to a 7 o'clock breakfast in their district with a group that's invited them to speak. They'll get to the Capitol. They'll have committee hearings most of the day. They'll go into session in the afternoon. And then in the evenings, they might have a dinner with a lobbyist, or they might have to go speak to someone in their district. So most of the time during session, their days are jam-packed from front to end, and there's not really that much time. So we have to understand that when we're dealing with our legislators. The second thing is the best time to build a relationship with your legislator is before session starts. So a lot of times we think about, there's these bills that's coming up and we need to call or we need to email, and that's true. But really the best time is before session is happening. So what that means is, and I use the word build a relationship. If they know you, they're much more likely to respond to you. So what does that mean? That might mean showing up to a town hall in the district where they're going to be doing question and answer sessions. That might mean actually picking up the phone and saying, hey, I want to have coffee with you. There are a few issues that I want to discuss. Now, a lot of people think, oh, that's crazy. You know, these guys are they're big and important, and they're not going to do that with me. Well, most likely at the federal level, that's true. You know, James Langford probably isn't going to come have coffee with you. But at the state level, that is pretty common. And so if you do have something that you want to discuss in depth with your legislator, wait until the legislature is out of session. And I would encourage you, pick up the phone and say, hey, can I come meet you at your office at the Capitol for 30 minutes and talk about X? Or when you're in the district, can I buy coffee for you so we can come and discuss this issue? That is a very common thing for state legislators. And so I would encourage you to start building that relationship now. So then when they're in session and they're busy and they get a call from you, oh, I know that person. We had coffee earlier in the year. So those are good things that you can do. The other thing is, on any given issue, most legislators actually receive very little constituent contact. So there were about 3,000 bills that were filed in the legislative session this year. By the time it's all said and done in May, there will be about 300 bills that make it to the governor's desk. So on the vast majority of those bills that are filed, nobody will ever contact a legislator about any particular issue. Now, on the big stuff, teacher pay and maybe transportation funding or any kind of tax thing. On the big stuff, yeah, they'll get emails and they'll get calls. But there's a lot of times, if they get 2 or 3 calls on an issue, that piques their interest. If they get 4, 5, or 6 calls on an issue, then you have their full attention. So that tells you about some strategy. Where do you get momentum for any issue you care about? Don't just you individually call your legislator or make contact with your legislator. Get 4 or 5 friends to call as well. And then they'll start saying, hey, there's something going on in my district on this particular issue and I need to pay attention to it. There's always strength in numbers when we're talking about dealing with our legislature. The other thing we need to understand is that available time for research is actually pretty slim during the legislative session. And most of the time, if they have a bill or something that they're working on, the information that they're going to get on that particular piece of legislation is going to come from a constituent or it's going to come from a lobbyist. That's going to be the 1 or 2 places they're going to get information. From time to time, they will get information from maybe a think tank or from model legislation from other states. But most of the time, if they're getting information, it's coming from constituents or lobbyists. Elected officials are understaffed. This is important to know when you call up to the state capitol. Most of the time, your legislator has 1 assistant during session. And that assistant does everything from constituent research and dealing with constituent issues in the district to answering the phones to helping to return correspondence. So my point about that is don't get frustrated at the gentleman or the lady who answers the phone for you. Because usually they're trying to do the best they can and they don't have enough help to do all the things that they need to do. And here's the other thing. Most issues are complex with many pros and cons and no clear right or wrong. That's hard for us to understand because most of the time we think, well, our way is the right way, right? If you just vote for me, then you would understand what to do. But that's actually not the case. Most of the issues have pros and cons to them, and it's actually a lot of gray area, and they have to use their judgment to decide which is the best way to go. And so that's also something to keep in mind. So if a legislator is not voting the way that you want them to do, maybe they need to be educated some more. Maybe they need to get some more information or material in front of them so that they can make a different decision. But usually they're going to go with the decision that based on the information that they have is the clearest and best information for them to make a decision. So, how should we act when we contact our legislator's office? There's a lot of people who think that ranting and raving is going to get you where you want, and that's actually not really the case. Remember, we're working here not for a one-off. If you're going to be truly effective in this political arena, I want you to build a relationship with your legislator. And what that means is, it means listening to them as much as talking to them. A lot of times we think, oh, you're the legislator, you need to listen to what I have to say. Well, maybe listen to their point of view and see what information that they have. And maybe you might find an opportunity to become educated yourself. A good relationship is a two-way street. It's dialogue and it's also listening. So first and foremost, there we go. Be polite. Just be polite. Just be nice. State your point of view. And also be empathetic. Understand where they're coming from. Understand the situation that they're dealing with. A legislator posted on Facebook, and this is a pretty normal middle of the road legislator posted on Facebook just a few days ago. Said, it's already 10 o'clock in the morning and I've already been called 3 cuss words. You know, people have told me that I hate kids and that I hate old people, and you know, it's just that kind of thing. And so when you're in that arena and passions are running high, most people, a lot of people don't stop to think about, hey, maybe if I was nice to this person, it might actually be counter against the trend, you know? And so being polite, being empathetic can actually get yourself quite a long ways. So let's ask this question too. When you're talking about talking to your legislators or you're sending messages to them, ask yourself these questions. Is this message helpful? Is this message helpful? So are you serving to advance the dialogue? Are you serving to provide good information? Or are you venting? Will this inspire positive action? So there's another good question to ask. What kind of action is this going to inspire? What are we working on back there?
Trying to get you a better angle.
So ask yourself, would I be happy if my friends and family saw this message? There's a good one. So a lot of times, remember, nothing you do on the internet is private. And a lot of times we kind of get in a room by ourselves and we get into venting mode. But ask yourself this question: what if my husband or wife saw this message? What if my pastor saw this message? What would they think? Remember, would I want to respond to this if I were the recipient? In other words, if you got one of those venting angry emails, would you really want to go out of your way to give a thoughtful and pragmatic response? Probably not. And then, would I want the media to publish this? Which is not out of the realm of possibility. When I was an intern in Washington, D.C., one of the first things that they told us was, do not ever send an email unless you were comfortable with that email being on the front page of the Washington Post. And that's a very real possibility. Where I work, my emails are subject to the Open Records Act. So any email I receive and any email I send can be on the front page of the newspaper at any time. Thankfully, that hasn't happened yet. But ask yourself those questions. Remember, we're trying to build a relationship. We're trying to build a dialogue here. And so these things are important. So this is a question I get a lot of times. Okay, what do I say to them? I got them on the phone. I'm writing them an email. What do I say to them? So here's some tips and tricks that you can use. Now, depending on what issue that you may be writing about, you're going to have to know those specifics of the points that you want to make, and I can't make those for you. But I can give you some parameters to work around here. So the first thing you need to do is you need to tell them you are their constituent. How do you know that you are their constituent? Because you have gone and you've looked it up and you know that I live in this person's district. Legislators care most of all about what their constituents think. And why is that? Because you're going to vote for them. That's exactly right. Legislators don't put too much weight on a person's opinion who doesn't live in their district, because you can't vote for them. So if you go to the Capitol or if you decide to send out a bunch of emails, don't waste your time and go to a lot of people's offices that aren't your legislator, because they're not going to care so much what you think. Now, there are some exceptions to that. It might be helpful to go by the Speaker's office or the Pro Tem's office, because technically they represent everyone, even though they have districts too. But for the most part, stick to your legislators. Second thing, list your address and phone number somewhere in your message. Why do you think we want to do that?
So they'll know you're in there.
That's exactly right.
And they get a hold of you if they need to.
Exactly. Perfect. Yes, Pat?
And they can send you campaign information.
Sure thing. Well, you may want to know who's running for office in your district. So, but it's always a good idea to list your address and phone number so that they can verify that you're a constituent, and also they have that ability to get back to you. Because you may want them to return a phone call or return a message. Be brief. Be brief. A mistake that a lot of people make from time to time is they decide they're going to write the treatise on whatever issue it is that they're trying to get across. Remember what I wrote about legislators, particularly during the legislative session, not having a lot of time? They don't have time to read a 5-page email over whatever the subject du jour is that particular day for you. My recommendation would to try to stick to 1 paragraph, 2 paragraphs max, particularly during the legislative session, because they're not going to have time to really read and digest a big long email, a letter, or anything like that. So that takes a little bit of skill and practice too, excuse me, because we typically want to get all of our points out. Get your point of view out, and then if they want to follow up with you, they can do that. Research the issue you're contacting them about and cite facts. Cite facts. So legislators always appreciate it when the person who's writing to them has a grasp of the issue that they're trying to write about. So if you write to them and you might be regurgitating some facts, quote unquote, that you saw on the latest internet meme, or on some of these sites that are a little bit questionable, and they can see that may call into question, your knowledge on a particular issue. So what you're going to want to do is do some research, cite some good facts. Don't overburden it. You don't want to read 6 pages of statistics, but use some facts to bolster your points. That always helps, and also it might convince them, or it might make them want to dig into the issue a little bit more. It also shows that you're familiar with the issue that you're trying to bring to their attention, which is always good. Ask them to take specific action. This happens a lot too. A lot of times people will write an email or send a message, and at the end of it, they're not sure what are you asking me to do? Are you asking me to research this further? Are you asking me to vote yes or no? Are you asking me to sponsor a bill? Ask them specifically what you want them to do. Know the bill numbers if they exist. So know the bill numbers. That's also a part of being an engaged citizen too, is if there is a specific bill out there that you hate or that you love, mention those bill numbers, because a lot of times what they will do is they will take that notation down, and usually their assistants prepare them a folder when they go onto the floor. And so if that bill comes up on the floor, they'll turn their folder in that bill and see if they've had any constituent contact on that particular bill when they're deciding how they're going to vote. So it's always good to mention the bill numbers when you're making any kind of communication. If you want them to return your message, specifically ask for that. A lot of times a mistake that people make is they call or they email in and they give their point of view, and then someone gets mad because, hey, he never emailed me back, or she never returned my phone message. And the question that I get from time to time is, I'll ask is, well, why didn't you, did you say you wanted them to return your message? Excuse me. And a lot of times the answer would be no, I didn't ask for them to return my message. So if you want to return, be sure and ask for a return. use a personal story. This is really important. If you can relate what you're trying to ask for in a personal story. So Aaron's a teacher. If you're writing in about teacher pay or education funding or something like that, your personal experience in the classroom is going to be one of the biggest convincing factors, because you're not speaking from an abstract point of view. You're speaking from something that you lived. So when you're talking about any issue, if you can make that personal connection, it will make a very emotional impact on the person who's reading or who's receiving that message. So always do that if you can. This is a good one, and one that not many people do. Hey, if they actually do what you wanted them to do, follow up. Give a call and say, hey, thank you for voting yes on that bill. I really appreciate it. I know that was a hard vote for you. Or thank you for opposing that particular piece of legislation. It doesn't happen very often. We expect a lot of our legislators, and then a lot of times when they actually deliver, we're not very good about following through. And now you don't have to do it. If they voted yes on 15 bills that you like, thank you, honey. Very helpful. And refreshing. If they voted yes on 15 or 20 bills that you like, you don't need to send one on every one. Maybe pick your favorite one and do that. But that's a good thing. Once again, it's part of that building a relationship with your elected official. Know where your legislator stands before you contact them. A lot of times, if you do a little bit of research, you can find out what your legislator's position is. So you might call them and say, hey, I know that you're out and you said that you support X and such measure, but I just wanted to tell you my personal story. So that gives them a little bit, hey, you've been doing your research, you understand where they're coming from, and that's always good to know where they're at. Or that'll help you when you're developing points. If you want to sort of counter their point of view, you can say, oh, I read in the newspaper that you said this. I would like to, have you considered this point of view? It's always good if you can to find out where they stand on a particular issue. And if speaking face-to-face, listen to their point of view too. Remember, we're trying to build relationships here, and so it's always good to listen to their point of view. You don't have to agree with their point of view, but just listening to their point of view is a good thing to do. So, how do we contact them? And what's the best way to contact them? Well, one of the best ways to contact them is to show up in person. Now, this is not something that everybody can do, which is why phone and email are so popular. But one of the best things to do, like I said before, is that personal interaction. Now, like I said before, showing up in their office during session, it's going to be a hit or miss thing. So if you just show up during session, if you get 5 minutes with them, you may be pretty lucky. One thing that most people don't know they can do, but you can do, if they are in session on the floor, there's a little desk in the lobby in front of each legislative chamber. And there's a very nice lady who sits at that desk. And if you can go to that desk and say, I want to talk to Senator Pugh. And she'll write it on the deal, she'll write your name down, and they'll send a page in, and they'll pull them off the floor to come talk to you. It's really fun to do that. And so I would say, now that won't always be successful because they may be voting on an important piece of legislation at the time. But if you ever go watch, and I encourage everyone to do this, particularly now, if you ever go sit in the gallery and watch the legislative session in progress, you'll see people all over the place. I think we have this view that everyone is just sitting in their chairs at rapt attention to what's going on in the room, and that's not the case at all. I see Bill smiling back there because he knows. They're all over the place. They're talking to each other. They're going back and forth. So it's not really anything to go up there, send a note in, pull someone off the floor and say, hey, I know you're busy, but I just wanted for 5 minutes to say, what's your thoughts on House Bill 1234? And I think this is a good bill, and I would love to get your support on that. Simple as that. Or you go to their offices. If they're not in, maybe ask their assistant who's there at the desk, when would be a good time to make an appointment to talk? Those are all things that you can do. But you just have to understand, if you go to the Capitol right now during session, you may only get, if you get 5 minutes with them, that's a pretty good day with your legislator. But like I said, don't just do it in session. Do it out of session, and you'll get as much time as you want. If you go up to the Capitol and you're speaking to them in person, bring something to leave behind with them. So maybe type out something with your position on it, with your contact information, because that helps them too. So you can come and talk to them. I wanted to come talk to you about the Medicaid bill. And here's the information that I have for you, and that gives them something that they can refer back to, and also gives something with your contact information on it too. So it's always good to bring a leave behind sheet with you when you go up to the Capitol. By phone. Phone is a good way to interact. Phone's going to be hit or miss, because if you call their office, who knows if they're going to be there or not. During session, you may get them, but when they're out of session, you're not going to reach them in their office by phone. So what you'll most likely do, if you call when they're not in session, the assistant will take your information and you'll get a call back later at some point. Now here's one thing too. A lot of these people have campaign websites, and if you find their campaign website, a lot of times they'll actually list their cell phone number. So if you can if you can find their cell phone number through legitimate means, I'm not talking about, doing some sort of dark web stuff, but if you can find their cell phone number and they've actually put it out there, I fully encourage you to text them or call their cell phone number, because that's what it's out there for. By email, so that's probably the most common way that a lot of people connect with their representatives, is by email. And it's not a bad way at all. There's a couple of rules there for email. The first is, like we talked about before, tell them you're a constituent, give them your contact information. The second thing is, do not use a form message. Do not use a form message. So there's a lot of times that you'll get something in your email and it'll say, this issue is before the legislature. Click on this link to tell Representative so-and-so to vote this way. And it'll have the form message all written out and typed, and you just click it and it'll send it to them. They ignore those. They ignore those, because those can come from anywhere, and there's no way to validate that they're coming from a constituent. And because they're form language, most of the time they can't, is this something you were passionate about, or were you bored one day and clicked a link in an email? So compose your own message in your own words to send when you're doing email. And that goes if you're going to write actually a personal letter as well. By letter. Now, 30 years ago, if you were going to sit down and write a letter, your letter would probably get lost in a stack of letters that were all coming with people expressing their viewpoints. Today, if you actually send a letter, that might actually be a good way to kind of get your letter, your email, or your notice to the top of the pile. And the reason for that is they don't get many letters much anymore. And so a nice handwritten letter with your point of view, you probably will get to the top of the stack, because every day they're going to go give them those cards and letters. And like I said before, they don't get a whole lot of those anymore. So that might be one way to go about. I wouldn't use letter as the only way to do it. You might pair that with a phone call, but a letter is actually probably a pretty good way to differentiate yourself from the pack. Social media. You see my cartoon up there? What does Sarah always say about what I say about social media?
It's not real activism.
Yes. Social media is not activism. Social media, for the most part, is an echo chamber. Most of the time, all you're talking to on social media are people who already agree with you anyway. And the people that you're trying to convince most likely aren't reading your social media posts. So most of your members now will probably have a Facebook page. They might have a Twitter account. and even less than that, an Instagram account. And then all the other ones, probably not. So here's the deal on social media. Some members are very, very good about responding on social media. So one I can think of right off the top of my head is David Holt, who just became mayor of Oklahoma City. He's always really good about responding on social media. There are a few others who are really good about responding on social media, but for the most part, members mostly use social media accounts as a way of pushing out information and not really engaging in a dialogue. So my only deal on social media is to say, if your member has shown himself or herself to respond to social media, then that could be a good way to reach out. But if they don't, I wouldn't really bother with it all that much. And I would go with some of the more traditional ways of reaching out to your members. Most of us today all have social media accounts, and it's a way we communicate with each other, but that's not the case usually for the legislators. So as much as you think posting that article or tweeting out that article is really going to show somebody, most of the time it won't. So I would just say, if you think that you're engaging in the political process by posting things on social media, most likely not. The best way to engage in the political process is actually reaching out and getting contact with your state rep or your state senator. Mass petitions, not effective. Not effective. Because once again, most of the people who are signing those petitions are not people who live in the district. So if you show your representative, I have 10,000 signatures on here of people saying you need to raise X funding or you need to do whatever, they're not going to care. They only care about their district. So once again, if you're going to be effective, one email from one person, great, fantastic, and fine. Get 5 of your friends together and send a message, even better. Get 10 people together and send a message, even better. And as long as it's personalized, it can be coordinated, that's fine. The more, politics is power in numbers. Politics is always power in numbers. So, once again, I just, mass petitions don't really do anything, and I would encourage you not really to waste your time with that. So, I want to do a quick dive into how does the legislature work really fast, because that's important as well. So a few basic things about the Oklahoma legislature. We are a bicameral legislature, which means we have a House and a Senate. And right now the current makeup of the Oklahoma House of Representatives is there are 72 Republicans, there are 28 Democrats, and there's one open seat in the House. And right now the Speaker of the House is Charles McCall from Atoka. Don't let those numbers fool you, though, on both the House and the Senate. It says there's 72 Republicans. There's like 3 Republican parties. And most people who follow politics know that. So everyone's kind of like, well, why can't the Republicans just get together and pass everything that they want to pass? It just doesn't work that way. There's 3 Republican parties and there's probably 3 Democrat parties. There are factions within all those parties, and so it's not as easy as, hey, we're all on the same team, let's all vote together. That has never happened in the history of Oklahoma politics. In fact, if you study Oklahoma politics, one of the interesting things is the governor used to actually pick the speaker and the pro tem for the House and Senate. And during the 20s, the legislature, even though the governor had picked the leaders of those bodies, the legislature actually made sport out of impeaching governors in Oklahoma. So it doesn't really always play out the way we think it's going to. In the Senate, there's 40 Republicans and there's 8 Democrats, and the pro tem is Mike Schultz. Now, the Speaker and the pro tem, they're basically the leaders of both of those respective legislative bodies. The legislature meets in session every year from February to May. Constitutionally, the first Monday in February to the last Friday in May is a legislative session. 2 legislative sessions make up a legislature. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because we are currently in the second legislative session of the 56th legislature. What that means is bills that were filed last year but weren't killed, that weren't voted down, are actually still eligible to be voted on this year. After this year, we go into a brand new legislature, so all those bills will be dead and we start all over again. Just some important procedural knowledge to have. I teach a whole semester class on all this stuff, so we could do a deep dive, but you would have to come to my class. So. Special session. Why is that important? Because we're in our second special session since the end of the last legislative session last May. So 2/3 of both houses or the governor may call a special session. Right now, we're in our second special session. So we are running concurrently with regular session. Now, what does all that mean to you? Not really a whole lot. Right now, the legislature is going alternately into regular session and special session and passing bills through. All that means for you is it's a little bit more confusing to keep up with things, and I'm sorry about that. So here's one thing I want to point out too, because this is why it's so hard to do some things that some people want to do. The Oklahoma Constitution requires a 3/4 vote of the House and the Senate in order to pass any revenue increases, what we would call tax increases. That was done in 1992, and since then the legislature's never passed a tax increase. So what that means is it is exceedingly difficult to pass any revenue measure in the state of Oklahoma. You have to have 76 votes in the state House, and you have to have 36 votes in the state Senate to pass any revenue increases. So when you're talking about the difficulty of doing those things that we think, oh yeah, why don't they just do that? Exceedingly difficult, very, very difficult. The legislature operates on deadlines. So there's no way you could get through 3,000 bills in a session if you didn't winnow them out through the process. So there's a deadline when legislator has to request a bill, and then a deadline to actually have language into the bill. There is a deadline that a bill has to get through committee, and a deadline it has to get off the floor, and then it goes to the opposite chamber and it has those same deadlines again. So right now, we are in, bills have passed off out of the House of Origin, and the committee deadline in the opposite house is coming up. So what that means is if you've got a bill that's in a House committee or a Senate committee right now, and it doesn't get voted out of committee by April the 12th, what that means is that bill is dead. And then if that bill that got out of committee doesn't get off the House or Senate floor by April the 26th, that bill is dead. And that's how we winnow down those 3,000 bills until we'll get to the end of session, and about 250 or 300 bills will ultimately be signed into law. It's important to note, because if you have a bill that you're interested in and you look that bill up online and that bill didn't get out of committee by the time of the deadline, it's done. And you have to wait and come play again next year. Want to talk about voting for just a second. And the reason I put this cartoon up here is not necessarily just for the school issue, but ultimately at the end of the day, if you don't follow up your action with your votes and with being an informed voter, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Nobody's going to care about what you think if you didn't show up to the polls and you didn't exercise your right to vote. So ultimately, we are responsible for our values in society. And so unless we follow up marches and emails and all those kinds of things of political activity with actually showing up to the polls, it doesn't hold much water. In 2016, 70% of Americans aged 18 to 29 did not vote. You hear that? 70% of Americans in 2016, aged 18 to 29, didn't show up to vote. So when your legislator blows you off if you're 25 years old, they know you're not going to show up. So why do they care what you think? That's where we got to start. That's where we got to start turning the tide there. 60% of Americans aged 30 to 44 did not vote. 38% of Americans 45 to 64 did not vote, and 15% of Americans 65 plus vote. If you're 65 plus in this room, they care what you think a lot because they know you're showing up to vote. For those of us who are younger than that, we're going to have to start getting our peers interested. We're going to have to start getting our parents interested. We're going to have to start getting our kids, who may be turning 18 sometime soon, interested. Because that's the only thing that's going to make it to where they're going to listen to other people. So, your local and state officials affect your daily life much more than the federal officials. That's just the rock bottom truth. And so a lot of people will show up to vote for president, and they'll show up to vote for Congress and their U.S. senator, but they will not show up to vote for their state legislator. Most people can't name their state legislator. Most people can't name their city councilor. You need to vote in local and state elections. So here's some information. The deadline to register for the June 26th primary election is June the 1st. June the 1st, register for the June 26th primary election. Well, why do I care about a primary election? Because that's where you're going to find out who's going to be on the general ballot. So if you're a Republican, you need to show up and vote for whoever's going to be the Republican on that ballot. If you're a Democrat, the same thing. The deadline to register for the November 6th general election is October the 12th. So that's not only register, but if you need to change your registration, if you want to change your party, if you want to change your address because you've moved, any of those things, those are those deadlines. In Oklahoma, independents can vote in the Democrat primary, but they cannot vote in the Republican or the Libertarian primaries. So that's important to note as well. Big important election coming up in 2018. So all statewide elected officials. So what that means is there's a seat on the Corporation Commission, governor, lieutenant governor, insurance commissioner, superintendent of education, labor commissioner, attorney general, auditor, and treasurer. All those positions are on the ballot this year in Oklahoma, including the entire House of Representatives and half of the state Senate. 2018 is an important election. Now, if you don't know what most of those offices I just named off do, what the heck does the insurance commissioner do? Now's your chance to start doing some research and to find out and to figure out who you might want to vote for. So, there's a good, the election board website is ok.gov/elections. Go to that website because you can do some pretty cool things on that website. You can learn how to request an absentee ballot. You can learn how to find your polling place. You can learn how to register to vote. How to update your registration, what forms of ID are accepted when you go vote, your election dates and upcoming elections. Also, you can view a sample ballot and follow the results on election night. I love the sample ballot because you can go in, type in your birth date, and then you can see what your ballot's going to look like. So you can see all those names that you have no idea who they are when you go in the ballot box. You can see who those people are so you can start researching them ahead of time. I've brought voter registration forms tonight. So if you need to register to vote or change your party affiliation, or if you need to change your address, you can do it all on this one form here. So we'll have these available for you tonight. Okay. Questions? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
How's the best way to find that out? On his particular website?
Yeah, so
Main website?
the best way is to contact them and ask them. But the other good ways to do that are to follow. One of the best things I do is the politics section of the Daily Oklahoman. Is a great, every day, especially now during session, almost every day there's going to be at least one and maybe 2 or 3 articles on what's going on at the state capitol. Now,
Updated daily as to where he stands?
yeah, they'll have articles at least on a daily basis. Also, the Tulsa World has a really good politics and government section that you can go to as well. I would also recommend, now this is probably not for everybody in here because everybody won't be comfortable with it. The best way that I keep up with news and information from the state capitol is Twitter. I follow journalists who cover the state capitol on my Twitter feed. I follow state legislators themselves who tweet out things. And so even if you have no desire to tweet anything yourself, the medium is excellent for keeping up with politics and what's going on at the state level. And I fully encourage, once again, you can dive into the Twitter rabbit hole and tweet and do all those things. But from an informational perspective, it is a great way to keep up with what's going on at the Capitol. And we have a really good set of Capitol reporters who they will go to a meeting or they'll sit in session and they will do what's called live tweeting. And they'll tweet everything that's going on so that you can just follow it in kind of real time. And it's,
They're voting right now for the revenue measure for Monday.
yeah, so the Senate's in session right now.
They're stuck at 35 and they need 36 to pass it.
Okay, some drama in the Senate tonight.
I know you're itching probably. Like
Other questions? Other, Mr. Pat?
300 bills sound like a lot. I mean, they can't get the schools paid, and they're doing 299 other things.
Yeah,
So most of it is kind of junky.
no, I wouldn't say that. There's a lot of times that for an agency to do something that they need to do, there's a particular fix in legislation that they have to do. A lot of times, and I've seen this before, for example, a lot of agencies are required to do all these reports to the legislature and all these different groups and entities. Well, what was written in before in legislation was you had to actually print a report and submit it. So to change that in the electronic age, they had to go in and change all that legislation so you could do it in PDF or you could submit it electronically. So a lot of it is just kind of cleanup language like that. And then the state has to walk and chew gum at the same time. And so what that means is the state has to take care of its transportation system and corrections and education. The state is doing all kind of things. And so 300 pieces of legislation is actually probably about right per year. And there are a lot of things that people just end up putting off till next year. And of course, you have to judge the bills on its merits. So some of them may be great, and some of them may be terrible. But
And I guess my point is that we only hear about 4 or 5 issues.
yeah,
And do you think for the 4 or 5 that we hear about are right? I mean, they're not gonna Twitter the guy they're not gonna pass that where we can do electronic mail.
yeah, no, they're going to focus on the big stuff.
Okay.
Yeah,
Last year, we had a piece of legislation that we just needed one word added to, so that churches could house people overnight in their buildings. They only had included the word door, and so if the room had a window in it, that wasn't acceptable. And so we spent the whole legislative session working on one Senate bill to get the word window added, so that churches could house people overnight in cases of disaster, even for youth retreats, anything. And it was the one bill that got held up because it was the only bill still alive in a particular committee at the end of the deadline week, but before the budget went. And so then we had to work all weekend just to get it heard, or otherwise we were gonna lose programs and other things.
Yeah.
We just needed the word window.
and just generally, I'd say you have to judge bills on their merits. The number doesn't concern me as much as what's in the bills. That's really what you have to pay attention to. Hey, Dick.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, I really wish we had legislative deadlines, and I was a little slow when I could remember all those, but where do you find those, like you talk about the dates, and you have to do certain things with a particular bill?
So that's on the House and Senate has a website.
Okay,
And so on the Senate's website, there's a row of menus at the top, and one says calendar, and they'll say deadlines in there, and you can go and find all those about when bills have to get through the
and
process.
let me ask you one more follow-up on this, on a particular bill, I tried to follow the bill occasionally, just to see what I could figure out on, and then I kinda had some challenges there, and I just wondered, like, if you have a particular bill you're interested in, can you figure out what it is on there?
Yeah, you can. I don't have time tonight to do a deep dive in how you look up a bill on it. If you want me to teach another class, I can do that sometime. But yes, you can go on that OK Legislature website, and there'll be a bill lookup, and you can type in the bill's number and look it up. But I will say this, and I don't know if it's intentional or not, but learning the legislature is like learning a foreign language. It's not built for the layperson. It's not easy. That's why I mostly say once you get elected to office, it takes you about 4 years to find the bathrooms up there and just to kind of learn the lay of the land and how everything works. So we all think that this is it's an easy thing and everyone should be able to do it. It's just like if I went to work to try to be an electrical engineer tomorrow. It's a whole different language. It's a whole new way of doing things. And so it does take some practice and some knowledge to kind of get in the groove. But I can teach you how to look up a bill and track it through the process. Yeah, Joe?
If the title's stricken, can the bill move then forward?
The bill can move forward, but before it goes to the governor, it'll have to be voted on with the title on the bill.
The title has to.
Yeah. The bill, constitutionally, the bill has to have all its parts, which means it has to have a title and an enacting clause before it can go to the governor. Yes.
Well, I'd like to say that everybody missed out on Monday night. We had a wonderful forum with all those lesser offices that you mentioned that are being elected this year. They came and spoke. We had a wonderful forum. Kirk Humphreys was our moderator. But I have little cards. We're going to have a forum on May 21st for all the governor and lieutenant governor candidates. We invite everybody to come to that. And because if you go vote, and you go and you vote ignorantly, and you don't know who you're voting for, and you just vote for somebody that puts out the most signs, then we're not doing justice to our system.
Yeah.
And so it's important that we learn where everyone stands. And Monday night at the forum that we had, I was like, oh my gosh, I will not vote for that guy, but I'm going to vote for him.
Well, and you're exactly right. So right now, everybody's campaigning. So if there's a forum where people are going to be speaking and you're unfamiliar with the candidates, it's a great way to go and find out what they stand
It
for.
doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat, because if you go to the primary preview and you're listening to all Republicans, you're going to vote for one of those against a Democrat. So you've got to learn both sides.
All right. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I've got two questions for you.
Okay.
Being fairly ignorant of the processes. So their session is basically February to May.
Yes, ma'am.
First of all, what are they doing the rest of the year? Do they have a part-time job at farming or whatever? And second of all, what is their salary? What do they make?
So right now, I'll answer your second question first. Right now, they make about $38,000 a year. They do not set their own salary. There is a board called the Legislative Compensation Board that sets their salary, and that board met in November and dropped their salary down to $35,000-ish a year. The rest of the year, so if they're good legislators, being a legislator is really more of a full-time job, because you're in session February to May, but the rest of the year, you should be researching bills and ideas for the next legislative session. You should be attending every pie supper and Chamber of Commerce luncheon in your district that you can to keep your, keep your finger on the pulse of your district. You should be going to conferences on different policy issues and learning about best practices in other states. And so there's all kind of things that they do. Most legislators who do a good job of it, it really is more of a full-time job. And you got to think, so here in Oklahoma City, you have a district, it's just right here. If you're in western Oklahoma, you've got a district bigger than some states. So there's a large swath. So you got to go to Woodward, and you've got to go to Guyman, and you got to go to Watauga, and so it can be pretty daunting. But a lot of them have jobs. Some of them are retired, so they don't have jobs, or they've retired from their main job. It just kind of depends. There's farmers and lawyers and pharmacists and bankers and preachers and a little bit of everything in the legislature. Anybody else? Yes.
So I was watching the debate on the House floor with 1010 XX
Yes.
the other night, and they kept talking about, at the very end after it passed, they said, can we have amendments? Or they made some motion about, after it went to the Senate, could it be sent back for amendments or something? So could you explain that?
Yeah. So if a bill originates in one form, say it starts in the House, so the House isn't the only one who gets to weigh in on that piece of legislation. So those bills that pass Monday night, they go to the Senate. If the Senate amends those bills in any way, they have to come back to the House for a vote. There's two things that the House could do at that particular point. They could decide that they want to accept the Senate amendments and do one final vote to see if they're going to pass and go to the governor, or they can do what's called, they can reject Senate amendments, and then at that point the bill goes into a conference committee. A conference committee is where the House and Senate get together and they essentially say, let's work out our differences. And then if they agree, the bill will be signed out of conference and it'll have to get a vote on the House floor and the Senate floor again before it goes to the governor. So right now those bills are being heard in the Senate. So what they're doing, what I've heard they're doing, I have to verify this, is because of the situation in the House with it being really tenuous right now, they're probably not going to amend the House bill. They're going to vote on it, and then there's what they're going to do is called a trailer bill. Anything they want to fix, they're going to just use a whole new bill to come back and fix whatever issues later.
So they're just, the bill I was interested in, I found out from Twitter, just that it passed, like Jay was saying. So
Yeah.
it doesn't automatically get sent to the governor at this point?
If they didn't amend it, then yes, it'll go to the
They
governor.
did not amend
They
it. It's
did.
going to
Okay.
Tom's desk, yeah.
The thing that just passed, sorry that I'm not paying all my attention to you. I love you, but it just got passed. But now they're saying it's going to the House tomorrow because the House wants to repeal the hotel tax.
So
Okay.
So
That's
it
what
passes,
they-
and they're also saying that people have reserved some right that they can flip their vote. In
Yeah.
the next little bit, what's that?
So that's called capturing it's a procedural rule. It's called notice to reconsider. And so what that is especially when bills barely pass, most of the time the author will do a procedural motion. He'll raise his hand, be recognized by the presiding officer. At what point do you rise? I would like to serve notice to reconsider. And at that point, they've captured that so they can vote on it again at some point. Now, most of the time, the author of the bill will capture that motion so that another person can't capture the motion and go try to flip a few votes and bring it up for reconsideration and get it killed. So,
That because only the person that can vote against it can move to reconsideration.
yeah,
So that's why they capture,
yes.
they avoid that.
So, yeah, so they're trying to protect the bill in this case. It's a procedural thing. They'll dispense with the motion to reconsider in a day or two, and then it'll go to the governor's desk. This is really in the weeds, people, and most of you don't even need to worry about it.
One more question, to honor everybody's time, or unless the group decides you want to keep going.
I make a motion that we keep going.
There's another good option, there's a great class at OU you can take.
That's true.
Trey, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
As teachers. But, all right, so let's say everything passes and it does go to the governor. So how long will it take to actually get a yay or nay and the bill to be implemented?
So this is a special session bill, and special session is still going on. So she doesn't have the ability to pocket veto it at this point. So really, unless they close out special session, she's got really as much time as she needs. I would not imagine that she would delay for very long before making a decision on that.
The floor shaking everybody's hands right now.
It's
live.
So Doug's watching it live. From what the governor is doing right now, most likely she's going to sign it, and I would imagine pretty quickly. But that's conjecture on my part. So, thank you.
Let's thank Craig. And it would be helpful to know if you'd like to do more of this and invite him to come and go a little deeper or go in other directions. I was talking to another clergy colleague last week, and